Welcome to Psychology the Daf. We are in Gemara Pesachim, Daf Nun Vav, and today we're going to talk about cures of diseases according to Torah philosophy. Now, the Mishnah toward the top of Amud Aleph mentions that King Chizkiyahu hid a Sefer Harufuos, a book of cures. Most of the commentaries, including Rashi, hold that we're referring to some type of book of traditional remedies, which, by the way, many cultures have, and some of them seem to be quite valid. Science researches different herbs that are found in the Amazon forest, etc. Anyway, this book was supposedly written by Shlomo HaMelech, and we'll see why I say supposedly, but this book was supposedly written by Shlomo HaMelech, and it had all these different traditional cures and herbs, perhaps could be a Masorah from Adam HaRishon, or certainly ancient collected wisdom of different cures. Now, according to the standard opinion of the Mefarshim, the King Chizkiyahu hid this Sefer HaRafuos because people were using the cures and not doing tshuva and not actually getting healing from Hashem, or recognizing that healing comes from Hashem. And this idea is very similar to a young child who, when he finds out that his parents don't have money, the child might ask, "Mommy, if Daddy doesn't have a job and we don't have money, why don't we just go to the ATM machine and take out more money?" Meaning the child is mistaking the proximate source, the immediate source of the money, from the actual source. The money does not come from the bank. The money comes from Tati working. The cures that are found in this book, or that are found today with modern medicine, are not coming from the doctors. They're coming from Hashem. So the Ramban also in Vayikra on Perek Chaf Pasuk Yud Aleph expresses a similar idea and talks about how people of great bitachon could become cured by doing tshuva and realizing that the particular disease is a manifestation of a particular problem. So that whole opinion is mainstream. The Rambam, in his commentary on this Mishnah, rejects this explanation as absurd. He asserts that just as food is a cure for hunger, and no one is foolish enough to believe that the food that they're eating is coming only from their own efforts, but they know that the good weather, the ability to plant in the first place, the intellectual acumen that it takes to plan out the crops, and all those things come from Hashem. And so also, when it comes to cures, why would anybody think that it's any different? And why would Chizkiyahu do something so cruel as to hide a benefit? Now, most people understand this machlokas at face value, meaning, well, the Rambam felt that would be silly because it's just like you recognize food, it comes from Hashem. Even though you eat, you could recognize cures come from Hashem. It seems absurd to have hid the Sefer Harufuos. Other Mefarshim seem to hold that no, there's an over-reliance on cures, and so Chizkiyahu needed to hide it. But there is a deeper philosophical disagreement that's fundamental, and it's about providence. And this is something that I cannot do full justice in a small lecture, only hint at it, but you can look the sources up that both are on my blog, which is always a written version of this Psychology of the Daf, and you could also listen to some of the marmakos I'm giving orally. Let's start with the traditional position of providence. More or less, plus or minus some variation, the traditional Jewish view of providence, of hashgacha, is that God, as he sees fit, can intervene in this world when he chooses and do whatever he wants. Sometimes we can't understand why he doesn't intervene. Sometimes we cannot understand why he does. But whatever the case may be, basically, if Hashem wants something to happen directly, he will intervene and make it happen. Now, according to the Rambam, just as God's emotions in the Torah are anthropomorphic representations of his essence, which are really not describable nor fathomable by anybody, so too are his actions in the physical world. We cannot fully understand his providence. We cannot fully understand how exactly and what exactly he does in this world, but the Torah describes him as a father, a judge, or a king. Not that he really acts that way, because those are human attributes. You can look in chapter 1 of Hilchos Yesodei Torah, read it carefully, and you will see that the Rambam says any type of human attribute does not apply to God. Not even the ability to change his mind or to do something different, because that's not what a unified God that's flawless in intellect and flawless in ability. There's no need to change. There's no need to do. It's complicated and very difficult to put into words. You can look at the Rambam yourself, draw your own conclusions. But what it means is that even providence itself, even the way in which Hashem guides the world, is not exactly like he's pulling the strings of a puppet master. Now, there's a great dispute as to exactly what the Rambam's position is on providence, and there's even deliberate obfuscation in the Moreh Nevuchim, because, as the Rambam says in his introduction to the Guide for the Perplexed, he says that he will deliberately hide some of the deeper truths that he's saying, because they are meant to be a secret until people reach a level of understanding it on their own. So the Rambam does allude to his ideas about providence, but they're not as clear, and even in places in the guide, they contradict each other. However, there is a basic theme which comes out very clearly in part 3 of the Moreh, chapter 51, read it very carefully, where the Rambam says that divine providence is commensurate to the degree that a person maintains mindful contact and attachment with God. Therefore, the greater tzaddik a person is, the more they will be able to somehow or another experience more providence. The less attached, the more the person is subject to the vagaries of random mishaps in the world. And if you want to understand how far the Rambam takes this in terms of divine causality, meaning how much does God really do in this world directly, as opposed to through his will and through the attachment of other beings to his will, you can take a look in part 2, chapter 48. Read that very carefully too, because you will see some surprising and difficult to understand concepts there. However, there's no question about it that in this basic way, without going into the details, this is what Hashem works in the world according to the Rambam. And going further, it's very clear too, not so much in the Rambam, but it's within it. But if you look at the Ralbag, who was a philosopher not always in agreement with the Rambam, but very similar to the Rambam. If you look in the Ralbag's commentary on Yov, chapter 37 and chapter 40, you will see that the way in which providence is achieved is through intellectual conjoinment, meaning that the tzaddik is given enlightenment. The person who's attached to God, his intellect becomes more and more enlightened, and then he is able to know, she is able to know what to do and how to do it, or how to avoid suffering and mishaps in this world, or how to even get cured. And that brings us back to the Book of Cures. The real reason why the Rambam believed it would be absurd to hide the Book of Cures is because there are no magical cures. It's all some form of art or science. And that the tzaddik, think about the story in the Torah where Moshe throws the branch into the water and it causes the bitter water to become sweet. According to the Rambam, that was some kind of chemical reaction. The point is that the tzaddik, the prophet, has insight and is able to therefore enact God's will and is able to understand God's will through the intellectual connection. And in a smaller level, even without having a nevuah or even Ruach HaKodesh, throughout the day, people can have mini Ruach HaKodeshes, meaning a small intuition or even an unconscious move in a particular direction that comes from intellectual attachment to God. Therefore, the one who's more attached and mindful of God, as the Rambam elaborates, I said, and look at it carefully, part 3 in the Moreh, chapter 51, the more a person can avoid mishap and bring benefit. And the less he or she is attached to God, the less that happens. So the idea of hiding a book of cures is absurd, because even if we hid the book of cures and a tzaddik came along and through some type of insight could be an unconscious insight of intellectual purity, or could be downright Ruach HaKodesh or a Nevuah, will know what medicinal herb to take, or even what action would be curative, or perhaps even a state of mind that would be curative. The point is, ultimately, it still would just be a cure. It still would be some type of natural cure, the knowledge of which came through divine providence, but the action is not. So what's the difference if you hide one book of cures? The prophet, or anybody really who reaches a level of enough inspiration, would redevelop that. Just as in today's times, we have all kinds of medicines that have come out. What's the point of hiding those medicines? And it's wrong to not avail ourselves of those medicines. What we should do when we take those medicines is we should think, wow, how blessed we are that God gave us life, and God gave us wisdom and intellect, and God, through the Torah, guided civilization, that we live more or less an enlightened and civilized life. Even the other nations of the world have been influenced by law and order that are represented in the Torah. And so we can live at such a great time where we can benefit from the scientific achievements of people, and we can be cured from our misery. And that's what we're supposed to think, and that's what we're supposed to be thankful for.